A guide to growing cabbage. Closely related to broccoli and cauliflower, cabbage has dense and leafy heads that can be green, purple, red, or white. It's a versatile, cold-weather veggie with tons of vitamin C. It's also got a ton of other nutrients, vitamins, and fiber. Cabbage varieties. Green cabbage. Cheers! A variety that takes 75 days to harvest. It has solid round heads and is tolerant to black rot and thrips. Early Jersey Wakefield. A variety with pointed heads, it takes 63 days to mature. It stands well and resists splitting. King Cole. A large, firm variety with extremely uniform heads, King Cole takes 74 days to mature. Savoy cabbage. Savoy King. A dark green uniform cabbage that matures in 85 days. Savoy Queen. A large variety that's deep green in color and has good heat tolerance. This one typically takes 88 days to become harvest ready. Red cabbage. Red Meteor. A firm variety good for all seasons. It's harvest ready after 75 days. Ruby Ball. Slow to burst, this variety resists both cold and heat and matures in 71 days. Cabbage can be directly seeded or started indoors to produce transplants. To germinate, cabbage seeds prefer a soil temperature that is between 55 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 and 24 degrees Celsius. Cabbage seeds can be planted outdoors 6 to 8 weeks before the last spring frost date in a cold frame. Then they can be transplanted to their final location about 4 weeks before the last frost. If planting for a fall harvest, cabbage can be directly seeded 6 to 8 weeks before the first frost date. Direct sowing. Cabbage should be planted about a 1/4 inch, 6 millimeters deep, while spaced 4 to 6 inches, 10 to 15 centimeters apart in rows. Those rows should then be spaced about 2 to 4 feet, 0.6 to 1.2 meters apart. Thin seedlings to be spaced 18 to 24 inches, 45 to 60 centimeters apart. And keep the soil moist during germination to prevent a crust from forming on the soil surface, since this causes uneven germination. Indoor seeding. Although cabbage seeds will germinate at low soil temperatures, seedlings are sensitive to frost. However, there's no need to use a heating mat, as normal room temperatures between 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit plus bright overhead light are ideal conditions for the development of cabbage plants. Start seeds indoors about 4 to 6 weeks before transplanting, and plant them at a depth of a 1/4 inch. Apply fertilizer to the developing seedlings, starting when their first true leaf appears, using a half-strength starter solution once a week. Then, once there are 2 true leaves, apply fertilizer twice a week. Typically, cabbage will tolerate below freezing temperatures late in their growth, and they take about 60 to 100 days to mature. Soil and sun needs. Cabbage grows best in rich, moist, well-draining soil with a pH between 6.0 to 7.0. Prepare the soil for planting by adding in some nitrogen. Either bone meal or composted manure will do the trick. As well, cabbage needs at least 6 hours of direct sunlight each day. Watering. Cabbage plants need good soil moisture. The best quality heads are firm, crisp, juicy, sweet, and sometimes peppery, but without any bitterness. So if plants don't get consistent rainfall or water, they can develop poor texture and excessive bitterness. Outer leaves might also turn brown and dry up, or the plant can fail to form a head. Typically, 1 inch of rainfall each week is enough, but the cabbage plants should be watered evenly, since uneven watering can cause their heads to crack. Weeding. Cabbage plants have shallow roots, so to avoid damaging them, pull any weeds out by hand. Frequent shallow cultivation will also kill weeds before they become a problem. Cultivate just deeply enough to cut the weeds off below the surface of the soil. and be extra careful not to damage the plants in the process. Special directions. Plant spacing will affect the cabbage's head size. Close spacing, 12 inches apart in the row, produces small heads, while large-headed varieties are spaced wider. Small-headed varieties are fast maturing and can be successively planted throughout the season. Heads can be left on the plant for about 2 weeks in the summer, or 3 to 4 weeks in the fall. Fertilizer. Cabbage is a medium feeder, so a starter fertilizer can be used when transplanting. Then side dress 3 weeks later with a 1/4 cup of a 10 to 10 to 10 fertilizer per 10 feet of row. Avoid fertilizing cabbage during their head formation, because this can cause excessive leaf growth and splitting. Mulch. Use herbicide-free grass clippings, weed-free straw, or other organic material to mulch the plants to a depth of 3 to 4 inches, which can help conserve soil moisture and prevent weed growth. Seedlings started indoors or in a cold frame are ready for transplant once they have 3 to 4 leaves, and the daytime temperature has reached about 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Seedlings will first need to be hardened off. Once plants have 5 true leaves after about 3 weeks, reduce their water intake. Place the plants outside where they can get a couple of hours of sunlight while being protected from the wind. Then slowly expose them to more sunlight over the next week or 2, bringing them indoors if night temperatures drop below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Once they're hardened off, seedlings should be planted 18 to 24 inches, 45 to 60 centimeters apart, in rows that are spaced 2 to 4 feet, 0.6 to 1.2 meters apart. Planting can also be staggered in 2-week intervals to prolong the harvest. Water the plants and use a transplant starter solution that's high in phosphorus and low in nitrogen and potassium. Beets, celery, beans, onions, carrots, and herbs like mint, dill, rosemary, sage, and thyme are all great companions for cabbage. Avoid planting peppers, strawberries, tomatoes, and squash near cabbage. Cold frames function as miniature greenhouses to extend the growing season. Raised beds can easily be covered with hoops for frost protection and also to extend the season. They allow for improved soil drainage, which is great for crops like cabbage that need well-drained soils. They also allow the soil to dry and warm up faster in the spring, which means gardening can start earlier. Cell trays. Sow 2 to 3 seeds into individual containers, thinning to 1 plant per cell after germination. Cell trays allow for better root development for cabbage plants. Cabbage aphids. Small green or black insects that are also covered in a white waxy coating. Cabbage aphids feed on the undersides of leaves, causing them to curl and crinkle. Large numbers of these pests can stunt the growth of plants, or even kill the plants entirely. Here's what to do. If aphid numbers are limited to just a few leaves, then the cabbage aphid infestation can be pruned out. Be sure to check transplants for aphids before planting and use tolerant varieties when possible. Reflective mulches, like silver plastic, can also help deter aphids from feeding on plants. Any sturdy plants can be sprayed with a strong jet of water to knock aphids off, while insecticides are only needed if the infestation is very high. In general, plants can tolerate low to medium level infestations. Insecticidal soaps or oils, like neem or canola oil, are usually the best method of control. Just be sure to check their labels for instructions. Cabbage root maggot. These maggots feed on the roots of plants, creating tunnels, and can actually destroy the whole root system, which impacts a plant's nutrient uptake and support. The first signs of damage from these pests are the wilting of plants in hot weather, or the yellowing or purpling of a plant's leaves. Later on, plants will collapse and can die completely. Unfortunately, once the damage from root maggots is noticed, it's usually too late to treat the maggot problem. Here's what to do. Practice crop rotation and avoid applying animal manure or green manure during the springtime, since rotting and decaying organic matter will attract these maggots. Be sure to remove any affected plants in the fall, including their roots, and destroy them. This will kill any maggots that might be left over. Row covers are also an effective option to help prevent adult flies from getting near plants to lay their eggs. Just be sure to set up the barrier by the time adult flies are laying eggs. Keep in mind, too, that it's best to choose a barrier that allows both sunlight and rain to get to the plants. Because of this, floating row covers might not be the best option for large gardens. Common organic cures for root maggot include spreading diatomaceous earth, a natural powder made from the skeletons of tiny aquatic creatures, around seedlings, or using natural predators like spiders, ground beetles, and rove beetles to fend them off. In some cases, intercropping with clovers or legumes can also be helpful in limiting maggot infestations. Cabbage worm. This caterpillar is gray-green in color and slightly fuzzy. After it eats the leaves of plants, it leaves holes and wet green droppings behind. Here's what to do. Hand-pick cabbage worms if you find them on any plants. There are also natural enemies like spiders, ground beetles, and parasitic wasps that will feed on these cabbage worms, which can be an effective and organic solution. Also, weeds attract and shelter these pests, so it's important to keep weed growth under control. Cabbage worms can also be prevented and controlled by using row cover or insect netting when sowing or transplanting. Cutworms. These are gray worms that curl their bodies around the stem of a plant and feed on it, which causes the plant to be cut off just above the soil surface. When their numbers are high, they can cause severe damage to the garden by causing plants to wilt and die off. Cutworms feed at night and hide in plant debris during the day, and they prey more on new transplants, seedlings, or young plants since their stems are more tender. There are a number of different types, but the most common are red-backed, dark-sided, and dingy cutworms. Here's what to do. Hand-pick any cutworms from the plants after dark, when they're most active. Also, keep a 3 to 4 foot buffer of dry soil along the edge of the garden to make it unattractive to cutworms. As well, remove plant residue to help reduce egg-laying sites, and get rid of weeds which can host young cutworm larvae. Be sure to till the garden before planting, which helps to expose and kill any larvae that might be present. Also, use compost instead of green manure, since manure might encourage egg laying. As well, try placing aluminum foil or cardboard collars around the plants to create a barrier, which will stop cutworm larvae from feeding. Simply place the collars around the plants so that one end is pushed a few inches into the soil and the other end is several inches above the ground. Adding a layer of mulch will also help to prevent any cutworms from reaching the soil surface, and natural predators like wasps and ground beetles also help to control cutworm infestations. Finally, try spreading diatomaceous earth, essentially a soft powder made from the bones of tiny aquatic creatures, around the plant's base. This creates a sharp barrier that will keep cutworms out. Flea beetles. Small beetles that are either black, a blue color, bronze, gray, or sometimes striped. Flea beetles jump when they're disturbed, and they also shimmer in the light. Flea beetles feed on leaves and seedlings, and the damage from their feeding habits can stunt a plant's growth, reduce yields, spread diseases, or kill seedlings off entirely. Young plants are especially vulnerable, while older plants can survive an infestation much better. Here's what to do. Use a lightweight floating row cover at the beginning of the season to prevent flea beetles from becoming an issue. There's also a homemade spray that uses 2 cups of rubbing alcohol, 5 cups of water, and 1 tablespoon of liquid soap that can work to repel these bugs. Test out this mixture on a single leaf first. Let it sit overnight, then spray the rest of the plant if there aren't any side effects. Dusting plants with plain talcum powder can also help, as well as using white sticky traps to capture these pests as they jump. As well, weeds attract and shelter flea beetles, so it's important to keep weed growth under control. Insecticides might help for about a week, but they'll need to be reapplied, and adding a layer of mulch is yet another option. Be sure to practice crop rotation and plant seeds early to give them lots of time to establish themselves before the beetles become a problem. Mature plants are less susceptible to damage, so make sure to protect more vulnerable seedlings. Slugs and snails. These slimy pests are either hard-shelled or soft, and they are nocturnal creatures who feed on the leaves and stems of a plant during the night. The feeding damage from these pests leaves irregular-shaped holes behind. Leaves can also be shredded or eaten entirely, and there will also be slime trails on nearby rocks, plants, and walkways. These pests thrive in damp conditions, damage a plant's growth, and also affect a plant's ability to form roots. Here's what to do. Wet conditions encourage slugs and snails. So, although it's important to keep the soil moist, it's just as important not to overwater any plants. As well, avoid overhead watering and keep any organic waste away from plants. If possible, hand-pick any slugs or snails at night, which is when those pests are most active. Beer traps are another way to handle a snail or slug problem. For this, dig a hole in the ground and place a large cup or bowl into the hole. It's best to use something with steep sides so that the slugs can't crawl back out when they're done, like a mason jar. Fill the jar about half full with beer and let it sit overnight. In the morning, the jar should then be full of drowned slugs that can then be flushed down the toilet. Another option is to place a barrier of diatomaceous earth, a natural powder made up of the skeletons of tiny aquatic creatures, around plants to keep snails and slugs away. Thrips. These are tiny, needle-thin insects that are black, brown, or light yellow in color. Thrips suck the juices of plants while also attacking the leaves and stems. Affected plants will have rough bumps, discolored speckles, or silvering on their leaves. Those leaves can then become distorted, twist, and fall off the plant. As well, thrips can spread many diseases from plant to plant. If the thrip infestation is severe enough, it can kill plants off entirely. Here's what to do. Lots of thrips can be repelled by sheets of aluminum foil that are spread between the rows of plants. Be sure to also remove weeds and debris from the garden bed after frost, and avoid planting next to onions, garlic, or cereals where large numbers of thrips can build up and then transfer onto other crops. Also, use reflective mulches early in the growing season to deter thrips. Spinosad and neem oil can also be used to spot treat heavily infested areas. Finally, release commercially available predators like minute pirate bugs, ladybugs, and lacewings, which are especially effective in greenhouses. For best results, make releases of these predator bugs after first knocking down severe thrips infestations with a spray from the garden hose. Finally, watering plants from above is another effective way to prevent a thrips infestation. Bacterial soft rot in cabbage. Water-soaked lesions will appear on the cabbage head, which then grow to form a large rotted mass of cream-colored tissue, which is liquid underneath. The surface of these lesions usually cracks and oozes slimy liquid, which turns tan dark brown or black when exposed to the air. Here's what to do. Rotate crops and plant cabbage in well-draining soils or raised beds. Only harvest cabbage heads when they're dry, and avoid damaging them in the harvesting process. Blackleg. This disease starts as light lesions on the stem of a plant, which then turn brown with a black border and become sunken. During certain weather conditions, those lesions might be covered in pink masses. As well, the lesions can also go below the soil and attack the plant's roots. Blackleg can affect plants at any stage of their growth, from seedling to maturity, and typically this disease causes wilting and plant death. Here's what to do. Practice a 4-year crop rotation to help prevent this disease. Also, promote good air circulation by spacing plants apart properly, and make sure that the soil beneath the plants has good drainage. Finally, control weed growth around crops and avoid working in wet fields. Black rot. A soil or seed-borne bacteria that causes distinct lesions to form around the outsides of leaves. These lesions turn yellow/orange and travel inward on the infected leaves, typically in a V shape. As well, these lesions might come together and give plants a scorched appearance. Leaf veins will then turn dark, and the stems of the plant might become discolored as well, with some dark rings on them. Leaves might wilt, dry out, and drop, and plants can eventually die. Black rot can happen at any stage of the growth process and can be spread by splashing water, equipment, wind, people, or insects. The disease typically emerges in moist, warm conditions. Here's what to do. Plant disease-free seeds or resistant varieties when possible. But before planting, soak the seeds in 122° Fahrenheit water for about 25 minutes to kill any lingering bacteria. Keep in mind that soaking seeds this way isn't 100% effective against black rot and might actually lower the seed's germination rate. As well, practice a 2-year crop rotation and only use clean, sanitized tools near any crops. Wash tools with a diluted bleach mixture, about 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. Then rinse with cool water and towel dry after each use. It's important to control the growth of weeds and to follow the recommended plant spacing to increase airflow around plants, while also allowing plants to dry their leaves quicker. Be sure to remove and destroy any infected plants and avoid overhead watering. Downy mildew. This fungal disease thrives in cool, humid climates. At first, downy mildew causes leaves to turn yellow, typically starting from the main vein, then spreading outward. Fungal spores that are grayish, purple, fuzzy spots will then grow on the undersides of leaves. Downy mildew typically affects young, tender leaves, and severe infections can also cause curled and distorted leaves. Sometimes those affected leaves can then become dehydrated and then drop from the plant entirely. When seedlings are affected, their growth is stunted, and downy mildew can also reduce crop yields while acting as an entry point for other diseases. When older plants are affected, in addition to the lesions they get, they will also seem more rigid and narrow as compared to healthy plants. Here's what to do. Plant resistant varieties when possible. Practice good crop rotation. Ensure good air circulation around plants. And water plants early in the morning. This last tip gives the plants enough time to dry out during the day, making those plants less vulnerable to infection. Downy mildew is usually spread when leaves are wet for too long, so it also helps to avoid overhead watering. As well, be sure to keep weeds from growing. Once plants have downy mildew, the best thing to try is to eliminate moisture and humidity around the infected plants. If possible, try to improve their air circulation through selective pruning. In general, downy mildew normally clears itself up in an outdoor garden once the weather warms up, since it doesn't do well in warm temperatures. Also, if there are any infected plants, be sure to remove all crop remains after harvest to avoid reinfection, since this fungus can survive in crop residue. Keep in mind too that downy mildew is much easier to control when a plant's leaves and fruit are kept protected by a copper spray. Copper treatments can begin 2 weeks before the disease normally appears, and when a long period of wet weather is in store. Copper treatments can also start when the disease first appears. Then those treatments can be repeated at 7 to 10-day intervals for as long as the treatments are needed. Powdery mildew. Small white patches will appear on the upper and lower leaf surfaces, which might also show some purple blotching. Patches often come together to form a dense powdery layer, coating the leaves and causing the leaves to curl inward. In some cases, eventually the leaves will drop from the plant. Typically, the white patches start on the older leaves and then eventually spread to other plant parts. Powdery mildew is brought on by high humidity and moderate temperatures, 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or 16 to 27 degrees Celsius, with symptoms becoming most severe in shaded areas. As well, this disease often acts as an entry point for other pests and diseases. Here's what to do. First, rotate crops so that members of the same family aren't planted in the same spot year after year. In general, a 3-year rotation is a good place to start. Plant disease-resistant varieties when possible, and then provide good air circulation by not crowding the plants and by eliminating weeds. Water plants in the morning to give them enough time to dry out, taking care not to get the plant's leaves wet. Consider spraying infected plants with certain protectant, preventative fungicides. Sulfur, lime sulfur, neem oil, and potassium bicarbonate are all effective. But these remedies will work best when they are used before the infection happens, or when signs of the disease are first spotted. Instead of chemical fungicides, plants can also be sprayed with a bicarbonate solution by simply mixing 1 teaspoon of baking soda in 1 quart of water. Make sure to spray the plants thoroughly, since the solution will only kill fungi that it comes into contact with. Also, potassium bicarbonate, which is similar to baking soda, can actually eliminate powdery mildew once it's there, and does the job fairly quickly. As well, after the growing season, make sure to dispose of any infected leaves or fruit. Once plants are heavily infected with powdery mildew, it's difficult to get rid of the disease, so focus on preventing it from spreading to other plants. Sclerotinia rot, aka white mold. A fungal disease that causes cotton-like white mold to form on infected plants. Irregular gray water-soaked lesions will appear on the leaves, while white-gray lesions appear on the plant stems. Sometimes the leaves and branches will also turn slimy. During warm and humid weather, plants are often completely destroyed. This fungus can survive in the soil for more than 5 years, and it is spread by wind, contaminated water, and by infected seeds. Here's what to do. Plant resistant varieties when possible. Practice proper crop rotation, and keep planting beds well drained. Also, add aged compost, avoid overhead watering, and keep the garden free of debris and weeds. It also helps to avoid using excessive nitrogen fertilizer, and to also keep rows spaced widely apart. If white mold is found on any plants, potassium bicarbonate is a safe, effective fungicide that kills spores on contact. Like baking soda, potassium bicarbonate is also a great preventative treatment because it raises the pH level of soil above 8.3, an alkaline environment that isn't ideal for fungus to grow. Simply mix 3 tablespoons of potassium bicarbonate, 3 tablespoons vegetable oil, and 1/2 teaspoon of soap together into a gallon of water, then spray it onto the affected plants. Baking soda itself has a high pH of 9, so it can also help to raise the pH level of soil for plants. And the baking soda creates a very alkaline environment that kills the fungus. Typically though, baking soda is best used as a preventative treatment rather than a fungicide. Mix 1 tablespoon of baking soda and a half teaspoon liquid hand soap with 1 gallon of water. Then spray the solution on affected leaves. But don't apply it during daylight hours. It might also be best to test 1 or 2 leaves first to see if it causes sunburn to the plants. In general though, as soon as diseased plants are noticed, those plants should be destroyed immediately. If the soil is infected, try to remove as much of it as possible and then replace it with clean soil. Barriers like plastic or mulch can also be used to cover the infected ground and prevent the spread of the disease. If possible, it's also important to remove all crop residue after harvesting. This disease can survive and develop if residue is left behind. And since white mold spores are long-lasting, the spores could survive the winter in this residue, if given the chance. Harvesting. Harvest cabbages when their heads reach a usable size, simply by cutting the head off above the outer leaves. Once cabbage heads reach their mature size, there's a risk that they will split before they're harvested. Heavy rain is typically a cause of these split heads, and this risk can be minimized by twisting the head a quarter turn or by shearing one side of the roots with a spade. This will reduce water flow into the head, which helps prevent splitting. As well, there are some varieties that are less likely to split. Storage. Cabbages can last for months, but only in cold and moist conditions. Ideally, cabbage should be stored in temperatures between 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit with 95% humidity. This is colder and more moist than a fridge, which can be difficult to achieve for most home gardeners. To store cabbage more long-term, it's best to do so in a root cellar. A time-honored way of preserving cabbage is by the process of fermentation. The European version is sauerkraut, while traditional Asian fermented cabbage is called kimchi.